Mizoguchi claimed The Life of Oharu to be the most dramatic and risky project in a long career full of drama. It was the 80th of his 89 films by my count, over half of them lost. By 1952, however, nothing Mizoguchi touched would be lost. He had become among the most dominant figures of the post-war era in Japan, head of the Film Workers' Labor Union for a time, and then director of the industry's governing board. Still, things had generally soured on him during the main period of the American occupation, 1945 to 49. Of the 8 films he made in those years, only Women of the Night found real success at the box office. His reputation took a dive during the ugly labor strikes at Toho in 1948, since he was such an individualist, not to mention a perpetually aggravating individual in a society of consensus. He was a target practice for Japanese critics, happy to declare him washed up. Yet he was about to enter his most illustrious phase, as he seems to have understood. He prepared for his comeback feverishly and with relish, planning an ambitious adaptation of Saikaku's picaresque classic, The Life of an Amorous Woman. In spring 1948, he submitted a synopsis of the project to the Occupation Censorship Board, which found it, quote, good material inasmuch as the writer Saikaku was considered a progressive of his time. Remembered as a champion of the commoner, he wrote from the viewpoint of finding a new sense of beauty, freedom of liberty, and the emancipation of humanity, unquote. The note went on to encourage any film that would prove, quote, that although women were looked upon with contempt in the feudalist ages, today they have complete emancipation and can grasp this new freedom created by the defeat of Japan's feudalist and militaristic forces, unquote. Unfortunately, this encouraging note was a bit premature. Japanese women were hardly emancipated, and Mizoguchi's film was not really cleared to proceed, for this note concerned only the synopsis, not the screenplay, which was still being written. 8 months later, when the full script came in, under the logo of Shoshiko Studios, the same censorship board stamped no good on the title page. The project was effectively squelched, but only for a time. Mizoguchi expert Chika Kinoshita has compared this Shoshiko version to what Mizoguchi and his scriptwriter Yoda Yoshikata reworked for the 1951 production, finding the earlier one much more in the style of Saikaku, quite biting and sexually rough. The celebrated novelist Junichiro Tanizaki, known for his daring erotic imagination, is listed as script supervisor in the credits. One might say that in modifying the script over the next 3 years, Mizoguchi had caved in to American pressure and ideology, except that he was never one to back down before authority, and by 1951, concern over censorship had diminished with the winding down of the occupation. So the new version, the one we are seeing, lost much of its satiric sting, but it gained tremendously in pathos because that's the way Mizoguchi wanted to go. Some sources suggest that he began actively practicing Buddhism in these years, and so would naturally stress the novel's intermittent moralism more than its notorious lewdness. And while Saikaku gave him plenty of ammunition to strafe the class and gender inequities of Japanese society in its crass mercantilism, as he had always done, he was more determined to monumentalize once and for all his lifelong theme, the suffering of women. Life of Oharu is a pure and unremitting example of exactly that. Even if Saikaku was himself a tremendously popular writer, Mizoguchi's adaptation was never likely to reach a mass audience, for he treated the novel as a classic. So too did the ad campaign. Just as the film premiered, a 2-page spread in Kinema Junpo, Japan's preeminent film journal, contained testimonials by a poet, an important Saikaku scholar, and even by Richard Lane, an American professor at Columbia University working at the time at Kyoto and an expert on Tokugawa literature. All proclaimed the importance of the source text of this ambitious adaptation. There were also notes about the originality of its music and choreography. The Kinema Junpo critics praised its scale and elegance, declaring it the first post-war film in which Mizoguchi's personal style was once again fully in evidence after having been hemmed in for nearly a decade by one government and then another. Then the Cultural Ministry selected it to compete at Venice in the sweepstakes of August. There Mizoguchi shared the international award with Rossellini and with John Ford, and there he garnered the attention of the French critics, for whom he immediately became the master. From then on, he was revered, especially by the Cahiers du Cinéma critics. Jacques Rivette declared, as foreign as Mizoguchi's language and culture may be, he spoke the language of mise en scène, and anyone who loved cinema could not help but understand it and be moved by it. Although Mizoguchi made contemporary dramas throughout his career, Sisters of the Gion and Osaka Elegy setting the bar for Japanese realism in 1936. Toward the end of his life, he felt right at home with literary classics. He responded to their formality and loved to place their characters among antiques and period costumes, of which he was a connoisseur. I believe he came up with the idea for Life of Oharu in 1946 while putting together his second post-war effort, Udamaro and His Five Women. For that movie also stars Tanaka Kinyo, and it also embeds in its title the name of a genius of the Tokugawa era, Udamaro, the most famous of all ukiyo-e woodblock artists. One of the original 1952 posters announcing Life of Oharu makes this connection, stressing the film's, quote, richly flavored atmosphere that brings to life the world of ukiyo-e, floating world prints at its height, unquote. Now it is true that Saikaku is known as the great chronicler of the floating world, of the rising merchant class in the booming cities of Tokyo and Osaka. But it was Udamaro who actually depicted this world so vividly in his prints. He can be considered the more genuine artist of ukiyo-e, if only because he had been born into that world. His father ran a tea house. Mizoguchi immersed himself in the floating world, in the theater, art, and fiction of the 17th and 18th centuries, perhaps to escape occasionally from the physical, political, and moral rubble of post-war Japan. And he identified with the popular artists who represented and participated in it, Udamaro and Saikaku. And let's not forget Chikamatsu Mansaman, the so-called Japanese Shakespeare, whose plays, written for the kabuki and especially the bunraku puppet theater, were considered masterpieces of theater already in their own day. Mizoguchi would make a magnificent film in 1954 from one of Chikamatsu's fatal love plays, calling it Chikamatsu Monogatari, the Tale of the Crucified Lovers. And so in the space of 8 years, Mizoguchi lifted his own art of cinema by using the greatest Tokugawa artists as a lever. Now each of these artists depicted ordinary citizens rather than the political, military, or religious aristocracy. This suited the post-war atmosphere. Mizoguchi proposed Udamaro soon after the Japanese defeat. The script was deemed passable by the American Censorship Board, which had otherwise forbidden period dramas because they might stir up nationalism. But they accepted a film on Udamaro since he was a man of the people, an artisan, and not a samurai. He was also devoted to the lives of women, a proto-feminist. This was a perspective the Americans were keen to promulgate as they pressed for women's rights in the 1947 Constitution. Udamaro was an artisan with aspirations to create transcendent beauty, something he attained best when representing women. The film follows his involvement in the tumultuous lives of his quite daring models. He kept enough distance to feel the flame of their ardor, so he would be inspired but not singed by them. Now Mizoguchi surely took himself to be another Udamaro, sublimating the ordeals of passionate women into exquisite prints, film prints in his case. As one of his collaborators said, Mizoguchi was, quote, fond of sake and women, too fond of women, unquote, and he was often at the brothels. Early in his career, he shared an apartment with a call girl. There were stormy scenes. One night, she came at him with a razor, slashing his back deeply enough to put him in the hospital, and worse, in the newspapers. This cost him his job. When, much later, his assistant Uchikawa noticed his scars at the public baths, Mizoguchi told him, "You can't understand women unless you've got something like this to show." He surely had those scars in mind during the scene in which Udamaro draws a cartoon on the flesh of a woman so the tattooer could cut into her back to make her permanently beautiful. Udamaro expected to be scorned by elite painters and patrons for this stunt, but he said that his was a living art, something that could be achieved best on flesh and through pain. Both Udamaro and Mizoguchi took outrageous measures so their art would be as alive as the women who modeled for them, these tragic women they knew from the pleasure quarters. Where Udamaro had his tea house beauties, Mizoguchi took up with a dance hall girl, the wife of a small-time gangster it turned out. He needed permission from a mob boss to arrange the divorce that allowed Chieko to marry him, and a melodramatic marriage it would be, with Chieko carted off to the asylum in 1941, where she spent the rest of her life in mental care. So when he made Udamaro and His Five Women and The Life of Oharu, Mizoguchi could scarcely hide his guilt over profiting artistically from such female pain. He said as much in a famous tearful visit that he made to a hospital for syphilitic prostitutes. The film couldn't be more explicit about the economy of sexuality. It concludes with a terrible love murder and suicide, which the perpetrator, Okita, the model played by Tanaka Kinyo, says she committed because she was following the lessons apparent in Udamaro's fervent pictures. We see Okita, disheveled and unhinged, enter Udamaro's studio, where she gradually confesses to the double murder. Nearly 5 minutes pass with but a cut. The camera delicately tracks and pans to keep Okita centered and to fill the rest of the frame with what matters to her. At first, it takes in Udamaro, silent on the screen left. But as her account of the incident develops, a track-in eliminates him completely from the picture, leaving her alone on screen with her female colleagues in the background. In this intimate company, one of the women, Yukie, the daughter of an aristocratic painter, can't help but blurt out, "For the first time, I feel like I know the path a woman should take." She and the other women rush out when Okita rises and with determination walks toward her certain death, leaving Mizoguchi's camera alone with the pathetic Udamaro. His women have vanished. Theirs is a shared hell from which he is cut off except by imaginative projection. Yet Okita swears it was his male imagination that brought on her terrible actions, for she confessed with real pride to having taken love beyond all limits, just the way Udamaro's devotion to his art was limitless. She learned about life from his paintings and prints. With an ethereal look on her face, she tells him, "Please take care of Okita in your drawings," and then she passes beyond the camera. Mizoguchi's tracking camera leaves her at the threshold. It spins back to find Udamaro quivering with emotion as he watches her go off to her death. He is overcome with the need to render the scene on paper, yet his hands are shackled in punishment for having offended the daimyo. I want to draw so much," he cries out pathetically. The scene restates, in its frightful consequences, the film's insistence on the equivalence of popular art and passionate life, by having life imitate the excesses of art. After all, the woman whom Okita stabbed has become famous and alluring thanks to Udamaro's tattoo designed in her flesh, and it was the art on her flesh that seduced Okita's lover, provoking Okita's revenge. All three die an artistic death, we would say. Art instigates the passions of life, which it then sets about expressing. This mounts up the spiral of the erotic imagination. Yoda Yoshikata claims he was consciously painting Mizoguchi's portrait while scripting Udamaro, yet he was unsatisfied with the script. They hadn't reached what they were after. They hadn't lifted themselves quite to Udamaro's level. It was right after its premiere that Mizoguchi suggested they turn to Saikaku so as to go deeper in the same vein. 5 years and 6 films would intervene, but they never wavered in their resolve to move from Udamaro to Saikaku. Meanwhile, he coaxed his longtime collaborator, the master set designer Mitsutani Hiroshi, to rejoin his team. Virtually all the masterworks of the 1950s featured not just Tanaka Kinuo as leading lady, but Yoda's scripts and Mitsutani's sets. Mizoguchi needed his team, for filmmaking stands in parallel to the printmaking trade 150 years earlier, which is equally a studio industry. Both are commercial arts aimed at the middle classes, and both require studios and lots of personnel whose coordination aims to produce beautiful and marketable images. As head of the Filmworkers Union just after the war, Mizoguchi made sure that his film depicted the roles played in the woodblock prints by models, carvers, colorists, and stampers, not to mention those who distributed and sold the images in tea houses and street front stores. But don't be misled. Mizoguchi was an auteurist. We treasure Udamaro's prints because they have a signature, Udamaro Kitagawa, the one who designed and executed them in a style and with an intensity that no industry can come up with on its own. Mizoguchi wanted to be taken in the same way. By titling his film Saikaku Ichidai Onna, Mizoguchi expected to take on not just the role of an auteur, but that of an author, one of Japan's treasured writers. Saikaku represented the floating world of ephemeral pleasure, but he wasn't so immersed in it as was Udamaro. For writers work alone, no matter what their topic, and Saikaku's prodigious output required long nights of solitude when he concocted his characters and his often lewd adventures. At the very end of his life, Mizoguchi's final project was to be another adaptation from Saikaku, tentatively titled Osaka Monogatari, but he died of leukemia before it could be put into motion. Saikaku's concentration and boldness inspired him. Mizoguchi inflicted it on Yoda as they worked over the script month after month, version after version. Instead of 5 women involved in the bustle of woodblock print commerce, now he would focus exclusively on one woman, who would be made to undergo decades of disappointment and increasing degradation. He expected to drill down to the core of his obsession with women, while giving Tanaka Kinuo the role of her life. The original poster shows her in 8 thumbnail images, each corresponding to the different woman's role that she would be forced to take on over the course of the film, starting on the right from courtly grace and moving down the scale toward the left, becoming a prostitute and then a tonsured sexless mendicant. Paradoxically, this film of debasement would lift them and the cinema to a new pinnacle. Although he followed Saikaku and his characters and incidents, Mizoguchi markedly changed the tone. A humanist warmth replaces the original's condescending satire. Tanaka Kinyo plays Oharu as the bewildered victim of terrible men, starting with the awful father who sells off his weeping daughter 3 times. Saikaku's amorous woman, on the other hand, is nearly a nymphomaniac who, after she becomes ugly and destitute, recounts her bawdy adventures for money and for laughs. Mizoguchi transforms this picaresque satire into a melodrama, something much closer to Chikamatsu's tone, Yoda believed. Oharu's father and son are paramount to her, and both dismiss her callously. But this allows her to pass beyond them to the far side of feeling. In the finale, she has become genderless, a mendicant without desire, having attained a state of blessed carelessness. And Mizoguchi's camera, settling as it does on the distant temple in its final shot, has learned from her, letting her go just as she has let her son go. Mizoguchi is identified with this character not by entering her viewpoint, seeing through her eyes. Rather, he stands beside her in solidarity with her suffering and sharing her ultimate release from it. Identification may be too hazy a term to characterize what happens in a work of art, but it's unavoidable here, starting from Tanaka Kinyo's need to identify with the role, actually the many roles, of the amorous woman. To succeed, she wore period costumes for months before production. She went to museums to bathe in the era, and she listened to Tokugawa music. Mizoguchi begged curators and antique dealers to let him fill his set and clothe his actress with the genuine article, so she could breathe the 17th century atmosphere and sink into Saikaku's character. Maintaining the mood was Mizoguchi's method, indeed his mania. He was conspicuous for never leaving the set once he had arrived in the morning. He took his meals there and, purportedly, made use of a urinal bottle. The set became the real world in which he and his actors lived, especially Tanaka Kinyo. Reluctant to cut into the mood enveloping his actors, Mizoguchi perfected long takes. There are about 180 shots in this 135-minute film, some 75% of them taken from the crane. This attachment to his crane, which developed in the late 40s, encouraged a mobile relation to the actress and to the action being filmed. He wanted to float nearby the actors, maintaining some measure of independence. Mizoguchi's most elaborate camera work begins with an actor's movement, then continues on its own until reaching a distinct, settled composition. Soon, the viewer identifies with the camera as a center of feeling and judgment. We sense someone standing within the shadow of the world that is lit up before us, adjusting to its developments, but also capable of arranging stunning compositions and of leaping conspicuously to different scenes through bold ellipses. That someone is the director-composer or director-arranger, which is how Mizoguchi is listed on the film's original Japanese advertising poster. We rely on this narrator-composer, feeling the camera's response to a modern actress's response to the pathetic situation that Saikaku scripted 250 years ago for his character, and which was, after all, his own response to life in those times, indeed to life in general.